Thank you everyone for the opportunity to submit testimony today. My name is Sam Griffin and I'm the Policy and Data Analyst at Open Communities Alliance. In a few minutes, hopefully, you'll hear from our Executive Director, Aaron Boggs, to discuss why House Bill 6611, also known as Fair Share Housing, is the right thing to do for our state because it puts towns in the driver's seat to take on their affordable housing responsibilities. But I'm going to briefly elaborate on the promise that fair share housing is not only the right thing, but the smart thing to do for Connecticut because of the vast economic benefits to our state and local economy that passage of 6611 would bring about. The research is unequivocal. Building both market rate and affordable housing has positive economic impacts, both direct and indirect. These impacts come directly from the businesses responsible for doing the development, the businesses in Connecticut that make up much of the supply chain for development, the employment both part-time and full-time in the construction industry, the building permit and impact fees and local property taxes derived from construction and ownership of new housing developments. They also come indirectly from the incomes from those construction jobs being spent with businesses in our local and state economy, the in-migration and cessation of out-migration that greater housing affordability would allow, and the increased spending of families that occupy affordable housing that are no longer cost burdened, that is, spending far too much of their income on housing costs. While the research draws a direct line between housing production and economic growth, it's worth estimating some of these impacts. Fair share housing will promote both affordable housing and mixed income housing, which includes market rate and deed restricted units for low-income residents. Conservative estimates of the aggregate 10-year impact of just the market rate units that fair share could bring about are over $60 billion in income for Connecticut residents, over $12 billion in state and local tax revenue, approximately 80,000 jobs over 10 years. And the economic gains from the affordable units would also be substantial. State subsidized housing units create nearly one job per affordable unit created. The average subsidized housing unit has at least one member that is employed, increasing spending in the local economy where they reside. Importantly, all of these benefits are in addition to undoing the economic damage that a lack of affordable housing is causing to our state. Imagine for a moment that you are an entrepreneur. You hope to start a business in Connecticut, a wonderful place to live. But you need to hire workers with advanced skills, managers, and also entry-level or low-skilled workers. A minimum wage worker in Connecticut would have to work 2 full-time jobs to be able to afford an average 1-bedroom apartment. You struggle to find workers that form the backbone of your business because these workers cannot afford to live where you want to start your business. Frustrated, you end up forced to look elsewhere for a regional economy with a housing supply that can support a diversity of incomes and levels. Yes, fair share is the right thing to do because our state is segregated and unequal, but it is also the smart thing to do because it will bring about economic growth and shared prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony today. I see Representative Dubitsky. And Mr. Griffin, I'm losing you on the screen.
I may have connection issues, but I can see you and hear you.
Okay. Representative Dubitsky, please proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I do see Mr. Griffin. I see him fine. Thank you for coming in, Mr. Griffin. Now, you recited a whole bunch of fabulous things that will result from this legislation. Can you tell me if any of it was broken down by region of the state or municipality?
Sure, that's a great question. So this comes from the 2019 report from the National Association of Home Builders, which estimated broadly for the state of Connecticut the impact of building multifamily housing, both on the jobs, the income generated, and the tax revenue generated. So it makes a number of assumptions about the average income of residents of multifamily housing, the average expenditures throughout the year. So it is only a proxy, and so that would definitely vary by region. But another thing to consider is that there are local studies and state studies and regional studies that essentially come up with different numbers, but all are in the billions in terms of the income and revenue generated and the tens of thousands of jobs. Hope
Do
that answers your
you
question.
know of any study anywhere that imparts some of these wonderful benefits to towns that have 1,700 people with a liquor store, a sawmill, and a tailor shop as pretty much the only businesses in town?
So I don't know of a specific study about a specific town of that size. The beauty of HB 6611 is that it has a different impact on the town of 1,700 people as it does on the town of 62,000. Essentially, the formula for assessing the regional fair share, which is then allocated to towns, incorporates the wealth, income, multifamily housing, and the poverty rate of towns. But it's also based on the regional, the number of people and households that are in dire need of affordable housing. So in a region such as Northwest Hills or Litchfield County or Tolland County for that matter, there will be a significantly less allocation of affordable housing to towns within those regions. And concomitantly, I would imagine you would see less of an economic gain because the economic gains are due to the construction of affordable housing and multifamily housing.
Okay, but in a town like mine where there isn't any shortage of space to build housing, there isn't any shortage of low-cost housing, there isn't any shortage of housing. There are plenty of houses on the market for sale. What benefit would there be to small towns like mine to say you now must have X amount of affordable housing when there is no demand?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I appreciate it. I would just push back that I believe there probably is some demand. Often the cost burden and the low income cost burden of our households is invisibilized and is often hidden. But our estimates are based on census data, which look at the cost burden for very low income individuals. So if there were no cost burdened low income individuals in your region, there would be no fair share allocation for your region.
Okay, but then your data is generalized statewide.
So we actually calculate the fair share need by regional council of government area. And so it is an aggregate of the individual need in every town calculated to the regional COG level. Because that is what the Zoning Enabling Act dictates. And then it is distributed among the towns in the Regional Council of Government region.
So for example, in my area, we have NECOG and we have CCOG. And in each of those COGs, there are very big towns and very small towns. So how would that be distributed between the big towns and the small towns?
That's a really great question. So our model
Your
takes—
5 minutes are up.
I'll just try to answer very briefly. Our model takes into account the income and wealth of a town, and the regional need is allocated based on the amount of infrastructure wealth that a town has to support additional housing construction and affordable housing.
Thank you, Mr. Giffen.
Thank you.
And Rep. Dubitzky, thank you. And if it's any consolation, I'll follow up on some of your questions actually to elicit a little bit more information in that regard. Representative Fiorello.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to ask you, because you were speaking about how we have to hire more skilled managers, and then you spoke about the minimum wage. And so that brings up the sort of lack of affordability in our state. But, you know, according to the National Association of Realtors, Fairfield County is 51st most expensive metro area based on average home prices divided by the median household income. And New Haven comes in, top 113. Norwich is 125. The point is, Connecticut comes within the top 150 of the country for expensive metro areas. So how does your bill create affordability? How do people afford this? I think when you speak about minimum wage and skilled workers, we need jobs, no?
Yes, to clarify, and thank you for your question. To clarify, I was talking about the inability of a person or household earning minimum wage from being able to afford to live in these high cost areas. So using the example in my testimony, if you hope to start a business in, let's say, Greenwich, since we're using that a lot today, you would have to probably hire people at a managerial skill level with advanced education. You'd also probably have to hire several people at a lower skill level, which would naturally garner a lower wage. Unfortunately, you would probably have a very hard time finding low wage people, low wage workers to fill those positions because of that high cost of housing exactly that you were talking about. In my hypothetical example, but one that we've heard from cities around the state, you might go and look in a denser area, populous area, one that has less zoning regulations and more affordable housing, so that you can get your business off the ground because people can afford to live and work where you want to start your business.
Okay. So your bill lays out these different percentages that towns have to meet, and they're open to some, litigation if they don't meet that. How does that help? We have experience with these percentages, and we haven't, we've struggled to meet them. And you're not adjusting 830G, you're just putting on new legislation with new percentages. Is that correct?
So I'm glad you asked about the percentages, because you talked about it in an earlier question and I wanted to clarify. So the percentages in section 2 that you're referring to are maximums or minimums. So they are not dictating that you have to achieve 40% home ownership affordable housing. They're saying your fair share cannot be met by exceeding 40% of home ownership affordable housing. Towns will have a slew of options and opportunities to create their own plan to develop the amount of affordable housing that is their fair share. Home ownership housing will be one way. Age-restricted elderly housing will be one way. Supportive housing can be a way. There are dozens and dozens of methods, subsidy levels, inclusionary policies. There are potentially infinite ways that a town can approach this. We simply say, the legislation simply spells out, it can't be all in one way, because if every town decided to build their entire fair share in only elderly restricted housing, we would have a glut of elderly restricted housing and not enough housing for families.
Okay, and I think there's a working group that decides what the fair share percentages should be, or do the towns decide on their own?
So the legislation spells out pretty clearly that the Office of Policy and Management will create such a methodology, but it spells out how the methodology should work. And it has to be based on a real assessment of the need, which is the extremely low income, severely cost burdened population, which for the state as a whole is around 135,000 households. And so that is the statewide number. Again, we're doing this by aggregating the town need to the regional council of government level, and then distributing that, allocating it using an allocation formula, which is based on the wealth of a town, how much it has built multifamily housing, how much it has encouraged economic diversity, all drawn directly from 8-2. Thank you.
All right, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Representative Fiorillo. Senator Champagne.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Giffen. You just made a comment about 135,000 And I kind of missed that. What was that goal?
So our need calculation comes from the HUD, Comprehensive Housing Affordability Strategy data, which looks at the income levels of households cross-tabbed with the cost burden levels. And so if you take all of the households in Connecticut, which is around 1.3 million, but then you reduce that to only looking at the low income households, you get down to about 570,000. But we're not concerned about necessarily low income households that are earning, or that are not cost burdened. So we reduce it even further to the cost burdened low income households, and that's around 376,000 households in the state. As we get lower and lower, we realize that even if we're looking at the most extreme need for affordable housing, so households that are earning below 30% of AMI, which is around $30,000 a year for a family of 4, and that are severely cost burdened, meaning they're spending more than 50% of their household income towards housing expenditures. So in the 4-person family example, spending over $15,000 of their $30,000 income towards housing costs. That is where we come up with the 135,000 household number. That is the basis, just the basis for our need estimate. Of course, as Representative Fiorello picked up on, not all of the housing that is developed as part of a fair share obligation will be for those levels of income. There will be certain targets. So you can't exceed 50% of the housing can't be for 80% or 50 to 80% of AMI because that wouldn't reach the lower need. But it also can't all be for extremely low 30% AMI because that would be very difficult to build. So basically there are a set of guardrails, but they are generally very flexible and allow towns a lot of discretion with how they are able to achieve their fair share.
Okay. So it's 135,000 more of these real low income housings that are needed, or 135,000 total?
There are currently, based on the HUD Comprehensive Housing Affordability Strategy data, 135,000 households that are below 30% of AMI in the state that are severely.
I only have a couple minutes. Left. So if you can just simplify the answer, thank you.
Right.
So it's 135,000 needed, or 135,000.
That is our base calculation for the amount of affordable housing that is needed statewide over the next 10 years.
Over the next 10 years. Do you have the answer for me? How many low income housing do we have in Connecticut?
So there are a number of different calculuses for this, and I'm sorry I can't give that abbreviated of an answer. Obviously, we have our Department of Housing estimates for the 830G Appeals Act. The appeals listing has about 150 to 200,000 affordable housing units. Importantly, our needs assessment excludes low-income families that are in subsidized housing because they would not be cost burdened. They would not be able to spend 50% of their income on housing costs if they were in subsidized housing. So in addition to whatever affordable housing exists, these are 135,000 households that are still in dire need of affordable housing. I would also point to the recent Connecticut Housing Finance Authority paper, which looked at the housing imbalance. So there are households that are in the market that are affordable to certain levels, but there is an extreme mismatch in who lives in those households. So if a household is or a housing unit, and you can cut me off, I'm sorry for rambling.
I'm going to cut you off a little bit because I'm just, like I said, I don't have much time, but I'm still trying to figure out what, basically the numbers. But what I'm looking at when we talk about low income housing units here, we're talking, what 500 to 800,000. I mean, that's a really big part of our population when we look at this. And this is all levels, this is from just a little bit that you just gave me. And when I think of the 3.5 million people, and, I'm figuring a lot of those houses have at least, one, possibly 2 to 3 people per house. That's a large percentage of our population that's living in below their means. And to me, it points at a bigger problem. It's a bigger problem than housing, you know, and I think it's the cost of living in Connecticut. And I think that's because of what's going on with our finances and everything else. Thank you.
5 minutes are up.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Champagne. So seeing no other questions, I have a couple questions. Rep. Lamar, I'm going to wait. Representative Lamar, you have the floor.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. I had a quick follow-up to Senator Champagne's concern about this being a bigger problem and not tied to housing. I didn't know if perhaps, given the data that you have and you've been able to analyze, how much of the affordability crisis in Connecticut is actually a component of housing. It seems to me, based upon all the data that we've had, that housing makes up the primary reason for why Connecticut is unaffordable. And I don't know if you could speak directly to that, or maybe I can direct it later on, but I have a sense that you've done research in this regard. Thank you, Sam.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question, Representative Lamar. So part of that is explained within this cost burden metric. We don't typically calculate cost burden for transportation, although we could, or about childcare, although we should. But we do know that for all of these households that we are calculating as the base need, they're spending 50% of their income towards housing costs. And so whether that's an income issue or a housing issue, it's clearly probably both. But everyone has talked about the high cost of housing. And I think it's sort of a chicken and an egg situation, but we can't kick the bucket to the next sector to solve this problem. We really need to start addressing it with housing because, as many people have testified today, there is a lot that we can do that's very simple to bring about greater affordable housing. One of the biggest ways through market demand that already exists. And I spoke mostly on the economic impacts. There are developers that are rearing and ready to go, shovel ready with architectural designs, site plans, and projects that are willing to build for-profit affordable housing through inclusionary zoning. And that is something that has only economic benefits and will produce affordable housing without any cost to the state.
Thank you, Sam. I appreciate it. And I just want to thank you and OCA generally for a lot of the work that you've done over the years, helping to inform this committee, the Housing Committee, the Transportation Committee, and various other entities before the state with all of the research that you've done. I know you play a large part in that. And I just want to thank you for your willingness to always be readily available to us to help us understand these issues, the complexities, and the data behind them. Thanks again.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you very much, Representative Lamar. Rep. Tibitsky, I'm going to ask a couple questions before you because I think some of my questions may be similar to where you were headed before, and I am willing to recognize you a second time if there are others who, first I'll check to see if there are others on the committee. But Sam, thank you for the information. And I think when you were talking earlier with both Rep. Tibitsky and Senator Champagne, we were talking a little bit about this 135,000. And if you could just once again go through the calculation as to how you get to the 135,000, and then the second piece is to follow up on what you and Rep. Tibitsky were talking about, how that share is calculated within the region. So again, those metrics that are part of that calculation. So the math behind both. I'm interested in the math.
Absolutely. So a fair share system has essentially two steps, which you've identified. The first is calculating the need, and the second is allocating that need to towns within the region. So the calculation for the first step is really based on the low income cost burdened population in a region. Literally what I did was look at the low income cost burdened population of Greenwich, and then the low income cost burdened population of Stamford, et cetera, for the entire Western Council of Government region. Aggregated those, and then we come to the second part, which is allocating those to the region. We wanted to use allocation factors, and we think this makes sense, that are using up-to-date and vetted data sources that are transparent and publicly available. And we wanted to have the allocation factors tied to Connecticut state law, such as 8-2 of the Zoning Enabling Act, which describes a responsibility for zoning regulations to encourage multifamily housing encourage housing opportunity for low and moderate income households, and to encourage economic diversity. So based on those factors, we came up with four allocation factors, which we use to take that regional need for the Western Council of Government and allocate it among the towns in that region. Those are the wealth of a town, which a proxy for is the equalized net grand list from the most recent year. Essentially the amount of wealth and assets that a town can rely on to fund their municipal amenities. We use the median income, and these are all relative to other towns in the region. So the median income is a proxy for both how much a town has access to for their amenities, but also is synchronous with the opportunity available to low-income households. Then we use the multifamily proportion, so the number of, or the proportion of occupied housing units that are in multifamily buildings, because that is directly tied to the 8-2 requirement that zoning regulations encourage multifamily opportunities. And last but not least, as a proxy for the amount of income diversity that a town has encouraged, again, a responsibility of the zoning regulation in the Zoning Enabling Act, we use the proxy of the percentage of the population that's in poverty. So if a town has greater wealth, greater income, less poverty, and less multifamily housing, it has a higher allocation of that original need number compared to the other towns in the region.
Great, thank you very much. And very briefly, because I'm sure time's about to run out. How does this work with 830G? Most of the bills we're talking about today that are not this bill are related to 8-2. I'm just wondering if you can speak very briefly to that.
So this does not change 8-30G. What we've found, though, is when towns engage in the fair share planning process, once they actually start to build their fair share of affordable housing, assuming they were going to build it maybe equally or semi-equally over their 10 years of their obligation, within less than 2 years on average, towns are going to have enough affordable housing construction to qualify for an affordable housing moratorium. So basically, this puts the towns in the driver's seat to start producing their fair share. And once they do that, they'll achieve a moratorium for 830G in a very short period of time, generally. The average is 1.8 years.
Thank you for that, Sam. Or I should say, Mr. Giffen. Representative Dubitsky followed for the second time, followed by Rep. Fiorello for the second time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for Mr. Giffen for your responses. How did you develop these formulas?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. So this was an interest of the Open Communities Alliance for several years. Before I got to the Open Communities Alliance, they started doing research about the best affordable housing policies around the country. I continued that research when I started at OCA, and far and away, the most successful example of a policy that encourages affordable housing throughout a state is the fair share system in New Jersey. We studied this in depth. We compared it to other systems like the ones that we've been referring to in Massachusetts, in California, but far and away, New Jersey has produced the most affordable housing of any of these state systems. We then started talking to the people in New Jersey that were responsible for this, and learned from their mistakes. And we asked for their help, and we started to figure out what we could take from that system that worked so well, maybe get rid of some of the pieces that didn't work as well, make our system conform to Connecticut law, and essentially that is that resulted in the bill HB 6611, which you see before you today.
And what do you consider a success of the New Jersey law?
Well, there are many metrics of success. For advocates, I think the biggest one is generally they're on track to produce 100,000 affordable housing units in a matter of decades, which I think is remarkable and far exceeds any other state. But I think another really telling piece of the success is how over 300 townships, boroughs, municipalities in New Jersey have come to the table, developed their affordable housing plan, their fair share plan, and started the process themselves endogenously from the creativity, the ingenuity that exists within towns and planning and zoning commissions. They have taken the onus, realizing that actually every other town is going to be doing this. I guess we can do this too. This isn't just, we're not being singled out here. Every town is doing their fair share according to this methodology, which is sound and objective. And so 300 and about 50 towns of the 500 some towns in New Jersey have actually created a plan and started building their affordable housing in the way that they want to.
So a little over half.
Yes, I wish I knew the exact number, but I think it's remarkable that over 350 towns have, or about 350 have come to the table.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you very much. And I see Rep. Fiorello, your hand is down.
Oh,
Right.
no, sorry. I do have a question.
Okay, Rep.
about
Fiorello
that.
for the second time.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. New Jersey has a growing economy, right? Okay,
I don't know much about it, but I believe so.
okay. And thank you so much for answering the question that Chairman Vahey asked, because that was very helpful to understand, like, trying to understand all this stuff. But does your formula take into consideration the allocations of where people want to live?
So we don't have very good data on where people want to live other than housing prices. And you can look at where people want to live are typically the really high cost towns. They're where,
Okay.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, sorry, I don't want to cut you off, but I don't have a lot
No,
of
go ahead.
time. Thank you. And then does your formula take into consideration where the jobs are?
Sure.
Is there a way to
So
calculate that?
within the equalized net grand list, a significant part of that is the commercial rateable assets. And that is going to be far and away, probably for Greenwich, for example, the biggest contributor to that. So that is a proxy for the economic opportunity in a town.
Okay, and then does that also, does the allocation consider where transit is?
It does not make considerations for transit now.
Okay, and then I wanted to sort of ask you, sorry, my brain is hurting. This topic is so hard, but the high household housing burden can be from scarcity of housing, as we're talking about, because now we want to, build a lot more multi-housing. But the unaffordability can also be from low incomes. So, you have a high burden because your income is so low. So if incomes stay low, no matter how much housing we provide, the cost of construction, the maintenance, the utilities, the taxes, all of that has to be covered. So how are we solving this for low income people?
That's a great question. And obviously, and of course, some housing is going to have to be subsidized. Part of this system, I mean, there are some people with very low incomes, and there is not a free market method for bringing them housing because of the cost of construction. So that will require subsidy. That said, for an enormous percentage of this housing, it can be cross-subsidized through inclusionary zoning. It can use tax-exempt municipal bonds. There are mixes of public-private partnerships that can be used to use some subsidy and some private equity capital. So there are just dozens and dozens of ways to get at different levels of affordability. But you're right that some very, very low income people will not be served unless there is subsidy. And we would use
and
state
I would
local
say, in defense of my wonderful town, Greenwich and Stamford, we do a lot of private and public partnerships to meet the needs of our neighbors. But thank you so much, Mr. Giffen. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you, Representative. And Mr. Giffen, I do appreciate and will underscore your comment is there is not a free market method for bringing housing to some of the folks who need it. And I appreciate that comment. Representative Veach.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Giffen, I was wondering on this fair share system, lots of numbers, lots of ways to equate this out. Is this documented anywhere? Can you send us some sort of an email or something? I need to wrap my head around those numbers, and I have a hard time doing that after 8 hours and 3 Zooms all day. So is that possible?
Absolutely. I can follow up with anyone, but also this is all available on our website, ctoca.org/fairshare,
Okay.
where our report is published. The entire methodology can be downloaded, and obviously you can look at your town.
Can you repeat that again? CT?
oca.org//
Mm-hmm.
// share. One word.
Okay. All right, great. That's very helpful. I appreciate that. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Veach. And I think it's true. These are very complex policies. Zoning is, and the housing questions, there's a lot of formula and there's a lot of math and there are a lot of legal terms. And so I appreciate the committee's hard work and focus on all of this. Representative Delnicki.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have been listening to the conversation here. And Sam, you made a comment about commercial being utilized in the formula. Now, you can have commercial tax base that is value rich, yet job poor. So how do you square that? Because not all commercial for the unified tax base is the same. And literally you can have storefronts, which would have a low value commercial conceivably, but a high population for employment. So I would submit that just using the terminology commercial is basically a faulted premise that can skew the formula one way or another and give you information and results that don't make any sense based on what the actual commercial is there. And I go to the high value manufacturing that is very, very low in the number of folks that are employed there, but very, very high in what the material, the equipment, the value of the buildings are. Likewise, an Amazon warehouse goes in and it's highly automated and only has a very few number of people working there. How do you square that?
Thank you for your question, Representative. So in addition to just the commercial equalized net grand list, we actually use every category on the equalized net grand list. So the primary purpose of that is to assess the wealth. So the assets on which a municipality has to draw on for funding its amenities, for its school system, for its roads, essentially as an approximate estimate of the ability for a town to accommodate new low-income population and new population in general.
Okay, you just used a term that I have a little concern with, how a town funds their amenities. Towns fund services to keep the roads in repair, to keep the roofs on the schools, to ensure that snow is plowed, and those aren't amenities. So how do you calculate what are amenities and what are base needed services?
Sure, I guess my use of amenities should have been more broad to include all town services, infrastructure, et cetera.
Now, you made a comment pertaining to the affordability, or let me back up. You made a comment pertaining to the question, where will subsidies come from? And you stated that cities and towns conceivably would have to take out bonds, would have to bond to provide subsidies as one of the methodologies. Is that correct?
The fair share system and HB 6611 does not tell towns which policies they should engage with. But that is just one of many options that towns have to utilize. Obviously, subsidization is one that is, from state and federal subsidies is going to be a major one that a lot of towns will want to employ. Inclusionary zoning is a major one that towns will want to employ. So that is just one of many on a long list.
Would, follow-up question, would raising the property tax on the people that live in that community be another way that you would see as a method to fund the subsidy?
If a town wanted to go about it that way, but I think there are some really creative ways that a lot of towns that we've actually spoken to that are finding using their own local ingenuity. And for example, again, to use Greenwich, they're coming up with a really ingenious fee in lieu system, which will go into an affordable housing trust fund from developers that are building market rate housing. And then they can leverage that for gap funding for low-income housing tax credit projects. So again, this is really coming from the town using their ingenuity and their ability to come up with what's best for them and figuring out how to reach their fair share.
So then another proposal, and I'm just going through the checklist of what you're talking about here. Fees levied, would this be higher fees?
5 minutes are up.
Something of that nature?
I missed part of the question, but in Greenwich, the system is a market rate housing. Sorry, go ahead.
And then I realized my time's up. So then there could be additional surcharges on building permits, additional surcharges on any kind of permit in the community to fund the subsidy?
If a town wants to go about it that way, that's up to them.